Good day, everyone. Welcome to Influencers and Inspires. I'm so glad you're here, joining us for this I think, our fifth interview of the year with my dear friend, Rabbi Denise Eger, who is with us. Thank you for being here, Rabbi. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Rabbi Steinberg. I'm honored to be with you.
Let me introduce you to those who don't know you, but after this interview, they'll all know you. Rabbi Eger grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. She graduated from USC with a bachelor's degree and then attended my alma mater, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and was ordained in 1988. She then 25 years later received her honorary doctorate, her Doctorate of Divinity. She is a leader in the world of rabbis and in the Jewish world on so many issues, in particular LGBTQ issues for decades and decades. She became a rabbi at the height of the AIDS crisis in our country and in the world, and I'd like to talk to you about that at some length when we get there. Rabbi Eger is the past president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the first openly gay rabbi to hold that position, something for which I know you're proud and we're all very proud. And it is the top position of the rabbinic group that Reform rabbis belong to. And also you were president, the first woman to be elected president of the Southern California Board of Rabbis. Not an easy task. That's not just Reform rabbis, that's all rabbis of Los Angeles. She was very supportive in the year 2000, where Reform rabbis should be able and encouraged to perform what we called then commitment ceremonies between same-sex couples, and of course then marriage ceremonies as well. She came out with a beautiful new book just this past year, which we'll talk about, called Mishkan Ga'avah, Where Pride Dwells, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So welcome, glad you're here. I should also mention your lovely wife, Rabbi Steinman, who is a friend of mine as well, and we have a tradition, Rabbi Eger and me, and that is every January at our annual convention in Palm Springs, we have some moments together over a cup of tea. All right, it's a glass of wine, but we always enjoy our time together. So thank you for being here.
I'm so glad to share time with you. It's always a privilege.
So I find your rabbinic career fascinating, and I've been following you since I was a rabbinic student in 1990, 91 when I came to LA. And you were a rabbi, I think the first rabbi at Beth Chaim Chadashim, which
first
was
first full-time rabbi and first gay rabbi there.
And a congregation that catered to the gay community by and large. So take us to the late 80s, early 90s. What was it like to be a rabbi in a gay community in the midst of AIDS?
It was frightening. First of all, to be a young rabbi who was ordained in a time when they were not ordaining openly gay and lesbian people. So I wasn't ordained being open and out and an activist. We lived in fear in seminary of being outed and then being removed from seminary because one was gay. So I took the only job of open to me at the time, which was to serve the LGBTQ congregation Beth Chaim Chadashim in Los Angeles. It was the world's first congregation with outreach to the gay and lesbian community. But it was the height of the AIDS crisis in 1988. That was before there were any kind of remedies or therapies used to help treat AIDS or HIV. And so people would get diagnosed and they would be dead 4 weeks later. The disease, the progression of the disease was awful. So just like we're living in a pandemic now, that was living in the midst of a pandemic. And it was a frightening time to be 28 years old. And my entire day was filled with going from hospital to hospital, funeral to funeral, living and trying to help people who were made to be pariahs. We didn't know how at the early parts of the disease it was transmitted. The government did nothing You remember in those years, the government, Ronald Reagan in the early 90s, they wouldn't even say the word AIDS. The government didn't help. So it was a time of great trouble and great pain and great loss and a lot of death, and very daunting. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot.
I am sure you did. And you were really a hero to many of us young rabbinic students as we were watching you do your incredible work. And you used a fascinating word, Denise, and I thought about it earlier today, a pandemic. You know, this is the first time I've lived through a pandemic, but for those in the gay community, this is a second time of going through this. And
Right.
I don't know, you can compare pain. I don't ever think that's a good exercise, but that experience must be very real and triggering in some ways.
It's been very triggering for those of us that both people with HIV/AIDS, long-term survivors with AIDS. I still run a support group in my congregation for all these years of a support group for people with HIV. We meet for Shabbat lunch once a month, and we've been doing it online even since we've gone into quarantine in last March. It's been very triggering for AIDS activists around the world. But there is lots that I have learned and I knew how to do in this pandemic because I already went through a pandemic. In terms of the need for flexibility, the need to, what we have to do for self-care, to care for ourselves, to not rely on the government. And this is something that we've learned so much, that in the early days of the pandemic, when the United States government was AWOL in terms of addressing the issues around COVID-19, was very similar to the early years of the AIDS epidemic, and that we needed to rely on science. And I will tell you that in the gay community, the HIV community, seeing Dr. Fauci brought much comfort because he was someone we all were familiar with from those early years in the late 80s and 90s in the AIDS epidemic.
Wow. A positive trigger in that regard.
In that way, that was a positive trigger. They had faith in him, and the level of frustration when he was muzzled by the Trump administration, we knew how to rely on him, that he would tell us science, not fantasy. And to see him so treated the way he was treated was very difficult. And so I'm pleased that he's back out teaching us how to deal with this pandemic, how to wash our hands, how to wear a mask, how to remain socially distanced, even as we get vaccines, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
You know, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and I think that I know everything and I'm hip and I can figure out everything, but I'd like an education, if you don't mind. And as you know, I think you're an amazing rabbi who happens to be gay. Or do you prefer to be recognized as a gay rabbi, or does it matter?
Well, I don't think I want to deny any parts of myself. I'm not sure that it really matters which comes first, chicken or the egg, if you will, Rick. But I don't want to deny any parts of myself. I'm a feminist. I'm a rabbi. I'm a mom. I'm a spouse. I'm a lesbian. I'm an activist, not just for LGBTQ issues, but for human rights issues, for immigrants, for the environment. So, and I'm a rabbi, and all of those things go into making me. But I do think that, you know, there are times where we are defined by our expertise on the one hand, and also we have many identities all at once. And so I think that they're important to not give short shrift to any parts of those identities.
But do we have to be extra careful when in 2021, when we're introducing somebody, you know, oh, this is our woman rabbi, or this is our gay rabbi, or this is our trans rabbi. Isn't it just a rabbi? Isn't the person just?
I would hope so. In a sacred community like yours, like mine, I would hope that we would just see people as a rabbi with talents and gifts. And yes, they have different lenses and different parts of their identity that we don't want to deny. But I would hope that particularly in our Reform congregations, that we have moved beyond the woman rabbi perspective, the male rabbi perspective, the trans rabbi perspective. That being said, we do bring different perspectives, you and I, as men and women. We've had different experiences. both of us have had certain kinds of privilege in some ways and not privilege in other ways. And those of us that are LGBTQ have had different kinds of experience of coming from the margins to the center in our Reformed Jewish tradition. So, I think what we have to do is really listen to one another and hear our experiences, and to allow them to be valid, even if they're different from yours. So your experiences as you said, a white man with privilege, a white Jewish man with privilege, as a senior rabbi of a large congregation, I wasn't able to secure a position as a senior rabbi of a large congregation because I was a woman and because I was a lesbian. So we have to still be mindful that there needs to be work on this equity and inclusion, even within our own Reformed Jewish community. That's the message that we're hearing from our Jews of color and our interfaith families, that the work isn't over.
So appreciate that explanation. I think you're right. The 80s and 90s, when I was a very young rabbi in the mid 90s, outreach was the big thing where we reached out and had all sorts of programs for interfaith families. And then we thought we succeeded and stopped doing those programs. And some interfaith families went by the wayside. And so we had to reimagine how to continually have the conversation and make sure our eyes on the ball, and how much the more so for minorities, for lack of a better word to say it, of this identity or that identity. And as you mentioned, Jews of color is an issue we're really addressing in the Reform movement now. I would send everybody to listen to Rabbi Buchdahl's sermon from Central Synagogue of the last High Holidays, which was brilliant. She is of Korean descent, and of course a Jewish rabbi, and it's a very powerful message she gave, I thought. Wake up call to us all.
I think this is right. And, we're always going to have to teach every generation, right? B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot etzlo. Every generation, you have to imagine that you came out of Egypt, right? And so in every generation, we have to teach all of these messages again. What about interfaith, about LGBTQ, about Jews of color? Even in our own Reform movement, we have to talk about Sephardic versus Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi. We haven't been as inclusive of Sephardic and Mizrahi traditions. Reform Judaism started in Germany. Of course, Ashkenazic has been where American Jewry for many years was an Ashkenazic trope. Well, the more recent Jewish immigrants to the United States have not been from Ashkenazic backgrounds. They've been from Sephardic or Mizrahi, Iranian Jews, right? Jews from South America, Jews from Italy, from Turkey. They have a different flavor, and all of their Judaism is Judaism.
Absolutely, amen.
The big tent. We have to think of the big Abraham and Sarah's big tent.
Amen. I love that. So let's talk about the lens of LGBTQ Judaism, or how people see their Judaism. But before we do that, maybe just give us a little primer on some things that are widely discussed, but I don't think widely understood, like the difference between gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation.
Right. Well, first of all, those are all different things. And we want to really think about them in a spectrum, right? So first we want to think about sexual orientation, like that's who you are attracted to, right? Versus gender identity, that's like how you were born, what genitalia you may have, but that may not be your gender expression, how you express yourself, which are often social constructs. So when we think about gender expression, does your gender expression match your gender identity? Does it? And your sexual orientation is something completely different. And so you really there's a lot to learn about this. And as we think about the spectrum of male, female, and then the fluid part in between, right? And there are people that do not identify as either male or female. They're not transgender, meaning switching genders, right? Transitioning from male to female, but there are a large number of people, growing number of young people who are gender fluid, who use they pronouns, who are not what they say, I'm non-binary or non-gender conforming, meaning you might think they're female, but they have a male haircut or they wear male looking clothes. But, so this is a whole different thing that I will tell you honestly, Rick, I think I find a lot of generational resistance. Those of us that are baby boomers and middle and like early millennials are having a hard time sometimes understanding this gender fluid, gender non-conforming, non-binary world that some of our younger friends and family members are expressing.
Mhm.
And we can't be so quick to dismiss them because we all have things that society has said we ought to look like, we ought to dress like, we ought to be like. Well, we have to ask why. Why? We always make fun of like the people on the red carpets. And we're like Billy Porter a couple years, the great actor that was in Kinky Boots, the African American, wore a dress on the red carpet to the Oscars. And there was such a buzz about that. But, dresses are associated with women's clothing, right? At the gender expression. But why? Scots wear kilts. Scottish men wear kilts. Those are also dresses. But there's a societal approval or disapproval. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, especially in the Jewish community, is to be open, to come with not judgment, and to talk about what this whole spectrum of gender identity and expression is, both from male and female, and the great fluidness in between, as well as to talk about sexual orientation, who we're attracted to, who we partner with, who our sexual and affectional natures are drawn to. We don't have enough discussion about healthy attitudes to human sexuality in Judaism, and that's the goal, to have adults and our kids, our teens and even younger, have healthy attitudes towards sex and sexuality that's not filled with judgment and hatred, but is filled as a loving expression of the divine in them.
It's such a beautiful and wonderful explanation, so helpful. I mean, I just have three thoughts. The first is, in confirmation in 10th grade, we talk about sexual facts and attractions and things that we're interested in and not interested in. It seems to me the synagogue ought to be the place where you talk about that.
Exactly.
The decisions to be ethical and meaningful and filled with a sense of holiness as you enter those years.
Exactly. I think what you're doing with this is exactly what the synagogue should be, a place to talk about the holiness of the other person, of ethical behavior with your partner, with your boyfriend, with your girlfriend, with the person that you are romantically involved with, and to how to treat them properly and ethically is exactly how we want Jewish values expressed, not to objectify the other person, right? To have that Buberian, Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian, that every relationship should be an I, thou, imbued with seeing the divine in the other.
Absolutely. And the two things that I've learned in the last few years, because I'm always trying to understand kind of at a different level, since I haven't lived that life, I want to understand it as deeply as I possibly can. Two things: not to use the word sexual preference anymore, because that it indicates that it's somehow a choice, right? And then this is the most beautiful thing I learned, that although trans is very popular and not offensive anyway, a better word is alignment. That where you were born in a certain body, but then you're transitioning to a different identity, and that is aligning you with what the original intent was. And I just love that idea.
So much of sexuality is in our brain. What we don't, it's not really in our bodies, right? The way our society, the way it uses pornography in such a negative way to fetishize bodies, both male and female bodies and bodies in between. But there's so much of sexuality and gender that's part of the chemical makeup of our brains. And this is something we also don't talk about. And so how we have that, the mind, our minds have to match our hearts and our souls and our embodiment as we live on this planet. So part of that alignment for transgender people is exactly that, to aligning the inner mind and the chemical nature of our brains and our minds, along with our hearts and our souls and our bodies, and our expression of that in the world is a really important thing.
Absolutely. So diving even deeper, Rabbi, the National Survey on LGBTQ Youth Mental Health 2020 came out several months ago, and there was a statistic in there that blew me away as a mental health provider and as a rabbi, that 40% of LGBTQ people who responded seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months.
Yes.
More than half of transgender and non-binary youth having seriously considered it. And I was wondering if you're comfortable sharing your own story of coming out and what that was like for you. You gave us a tidbit about rabbinical school, and that's an alarming statistic. And the last question of that, what can we do to reverse those numbers?
Well, it is an alarming number. You are exactly right. The epidemic around of LGBTQ youth, or even questioning youth, they may not even know about their own identities yet, their own sexual orientation or gender expression. They may have come in with questions, but there's so much lack of safety to talk about these issues, as you and I just mentioned, that they are afraid. And they think that they are the only ones, and that since we don't talk about it, people do self-harm. And that's why I'm so glad there's a wonderful organization called the Trevor Project, which has a national hotline to talk to any teen, to talk to any adult around these very issues, so that you don't have to be alone around issues around LGBTQ, particularly issues, and dealing with the potential for self-harm. But what can we do about it is exactly what we were talking about. Create more safe places, non-judgmental spaces for young people to have honest conversations, and trusted adults that are not going to throw them out of their house, adults that are not going to harm them because of who they are. And the truth of the matter is, there is a lot that still happens. You know, my synagogue, where I'm the rabbi, Rick, is in West Hollywood, but we're right on the edge of Hollywood, and most of the street youth that are homeless on the streets are young kids who have been thrown out of their homes because they're queer, because they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or non-gender conforming by their parents. And we have to mention that there is so much of fundamentalist religion, both Jewish and Christian and Islamic and others, that have done so much harm and violence towards LGBTQ people and LGBTQ youth, that continues to fuel the fire. And so in many ways, you know, a place like your synagogue, like my synagogue, as a place of safety, a place where LGBTQ people can be valued as the individuals that they are, and seen as part and become part of the fabric of the community, is critically important in helping address these issues. I want to share with you, if I might, because you know, we published a book this last year, Mishkan Ga'avah, Where Pride Dwells, and it's really a prayer book published by the CCAR Press, the Central Conference of American Rabbis Press, and it shares a name, Rick, with all of the Reform prayer books, Mishkan Tefillah for Shabbat and festivals, and Mishkan HaNefesh, our High Holy Day Machzor, our High Holy Day prayer book. It is an LGBTQ supplemental prayer book for the Jewish community. And I want to share with you, because one of the prayers written in here, it was written by a young woman who is now 20. She's lives in Florida, but she didn't feel like she could even be open, and she grew up in a Reform congregation. And she wrote a prayer that's kind of a variation on the Hashkivenu prayer for peace and safety. And she wrote a prayer about wanting to be safe when she brought her partner home. She was worried about how her parents would react, that they might reject her and love her. So even in our own Reform communities, there's still this fear of rejection, this fear, lack of understanding. And She published her prayer anonymously because she was still in this day and this time, afraid of what the consequences might be. But I want to just share one really,
Please.
really beautiful prayer, because in the LGBTQ community, some of us have children. I have a son; he's now 27. Others,
A great baseball player, I might add.
Well, he was a great baseball player. Yeah, that's true. But others do not, and this is a really interesting prayer written by a young rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Dave Yadid, based on the prayer in the Amidah, the Avot and Imahot. But this is called a blessing for my LGBTQ ancestors. You who fought to love, you who prayed to the same God I do, you who insisted on your dignity even when the world said you had none, you who died of AIDS while fighting for a cure so that people like me might live, you who were shot in a massacre on the dance floor, you who could not come out and held your secret until your dying day, you who were insulted, shamed, beaten, and brutalized, yet kept walking, you who contributed your fierceness, your originality, your art, and your voice to this world, I walk in your memory. I walk this path smoothed and chartered by your sacrifice towards justice, towards holiness, towards freedom. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Blessed are you, Adonai, Sarah's helper and Abraham's shield.
Amen.
Wow. It's a wonderful acknowledgement of the past struggles for LGBTQ people, of the shame and the brutalization and violence that often happened in a different generation and a different time, and the power for this younger, newer generation, the world we're living in now, where we've taken so many positive strides for civil rights, for inclusion, and to acknowledge that ancestral gift of pride and beauty. And it really gives me shivers.
Absolutely. Amen to that again. I would give it a plug in this regard. It's a very powerful statement, about the Reform movement. I think it's aspirational in that we are striving towards this inclusion place. And I often tell parents who struggle with this issue or that issue with their children, there's a difference between understanding and loving. You may not get to the understanding part, but you got to stay with the loving part. And this book is a perfect opportunity to demonstrate one's love. If you have a gay child or a lesbian child and you don't quite understand or to get it, it doesn't matter. If you love your child, buy this book and give it to them as a gift, or keep it in your own home as a gift when they come for Shabbat, and open it up. Don't even say a word about it. Just open it up and start reading the blessing for the candles or the blessing for having a gay child, whatever it might be. These are very powerful stories. Again, understanding is wonderfully aspirational and we should always strive for that, but loving we can do. And this prayer book is a very loving, that's the word I would use to describe it after I read it a few months ago. It's just filled with love. And I think it's an opportunity as a real gift, literally and figuratively, to our children, to our brothers or sisters, to our friends who identify as LGBTQ, to say, you matter, I care about you, and this is one way I'm loving you.
And I agree with you. And there's prayers in here for parents who struggled with a child's coming out, prayers for parents who struggled with a child's transition in gender. This is the whole encompassing of the community. So I think that's another piece of that, as well as opportunities for communities, sacred communities like your congregation, to be able to observe what we call the queer holy days, just like the Jewish holidays. It's not just pride, gay pride events and parades and those kinds of things for Pride Shabbat, but what's a way as we prepare and think forward to Passover, the story of liberation of the Jewish people. Who else needs liberated? There's some wonderful readings about that could be added to a Passover Seder to talk about the LGBTQ community and being liberated from oppression in Mishkan Ga'avah, where pride dwells.
Get the book. It's a must. I could talk to you for hours. I mean, I just love engaging with you. My last question essentially is this, Rabbi. What was it like to be the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis? What were its joys and what were its oys? And
Joys and joys.
yeah, Deborah, that's a Deborah Lipstadt line. I can't steal it altogether, but I'm just curious, particularly as the first openly gay president of our organization, it must have come with some challenges, I would imagine, and some overwhelming joyous parts.
Mostly it was great joy. It was one of the biggest privileges and honors of my life, I have to say. There's more than 2,300 Reform rabbis worldwide. It's not just in North America, although it says Central America Conference of American Rabbis, but we have rabbis in Europe and Australia and South Africa and South America and Israel, the former Soviet Union. And so I got to travel to meet a lot of our colleagues around the world and to see Judaism alive in so many different forms and congregations, big and small, of all sizes and shapes, thriving and being creative and supporting our colleagues. That was really what a gift, what a beautiful gift. And to be part of deep conversations in the leadership of our movement and thinking about social justice in a very large way. I was the president from 2015 to 2017. And so those were sometimes challenging years. I will say one of the hardest moments came on the day I was to be installed. Our convention was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and there's usually it starts on a Sunday, and usually on the Monday there's a big service, as you know, Rick, and an installation service, and the new president gets to give a sermon. And as I was getting dressed early in the morning, a call came into my hotel room, and we were busy getting dressed and going to go down to grab a quick breakfast before the service started, and a death threat. I picked up the phone. Who's going to call at 7 o'clock? I thought maybe my son over in the next room, he needed something, whatever. Hi. And it was a death threat. It had already been in the papers in Philadelphia and nationally that the Central Conference of American Rabbis was going to install in Philadelphia the first openly gay or lesbian person as the president of the conference.
Wow.
And that was really frightening. I had a bodyguard for the rest of the convention that slept outside our room. We had to change rooms and put our name, an assumed name, at the hotel. The bodyguard stood outside our room 24/7. Wherever I walked in the hotel. We went to dinner one night out, and the bodyguards were there at the restaurant that we went to. My family went to. So, it's very telling, though. I tell you the story not for sympathy, but I tell you the story to share with you that the world still carries so much hatred towards LGBTQ people. And even though we might have marriage equality, that we worked hard for, both in California, fighting against Prop 8 and working through the courts and working through the legislatures, and though the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled favorably in the Obergefell case for marriage equality, there's still much work to be done. And we still, in many states in the United States, you still don't have full equality. You and I are California rabbis. Things are much better here than they are in many other places. But there still is, as I said, sometimes the social stigma, religious organizations that think they somehow have special rights to promote their religion over what our Constitution says. And of course, we've seen some terrible setbacks with, bakers being allowed to refuse making a cake for somebody, right. No public accommodation. So there's still work to be done, and there will still be work to be done. And I'm glad to be part of a movement and a denomination of Judaism that stands for equality and equity for LGBTQ people.
Me too. I want to conclude by telling you this and then give you the last word. Each of us, as we grow up, have what a rabbi is in our mind, right? So for me, there are two rabbis in my mind when somebody says the word rabbi. It's Rabbi Raskin, who I grew up with. I don't know if you knew Rabbi Raskin.
Yes, I remember very well.
Deep, resonant voice. He wore a mitre, big black robe, and just a beautiful soul and spirit. And wonderful, wonderful person. And, you know, when one thinks of a rabbi, that might be the kind of person one would think about. That was my childhood rabbi. The other rabbi I think of when somebody says rabbi is you. A social activist, a beautiful shliach tzibur, someone who leads us in worship, an amazing sermonizer, and a real visionary and a compassionate soul. And I've been the beneficiary of that compassion. And I am very grateful for your role in my life and in my rabbinate. So glad you spent a few minutes with us and my congregation, who will be delighted to get to know you. And then after the pandemic, maybe you'll come down for Shabbos and take a break from Kol Ami in West Hollywood and check out Orange County a little bit.
I'd love to be with you. I'd love to share Shabbat with you. You know how fond I am of you, Rabbi, and your leadership and our movement and the work you do for our conference. I know you serve on a number of very important and sensitive committees, and you do so with great sensitivity and wisdom. And I'm grateful for your leadership as well.
Thank you. God bless. Be safe.
You too. Be safe. Nice to be with you and your community.